Good evening, everyone. Very, very warm welcome to Strand Group 71, or 180 if you include our predecessor organisation, which I do, over 20 years ago when I was young and promising. So I'm the director of the Strand Group, John Davies, and what we do, for those of you who are new to us, is we study the contemporary history of government through teaching, research and events, but also bringing together academia, government and business. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is a small but perfectly formed group of visiting faculty. There's plenty here, front rows basically as well, who we don't appoint loads, but those we appoint we love. And our very newest visiting professor is Gareth Davies, Permanent Secretary, Department for Business and Trade. So this is inaugural lecture time, and they can be really quite formal. My own one was very formal earlier this year, but actually, when we're doing it for the visiting faculty, it's just nice, and it's just a nice welcome. Now, this will be the first of many events, and it's part of a new institutional partnership, which also sees officials taking our new MA Government Studies. We've also got, as part of this, a new PhD underway, the Institutional History of the Department for Business and Trade, and I'm delighted that Amelia Braddon here has just started, and she's in the first flushes of happiness and hope as the PhD begins, but there's plenty of us who've actually done them or are in the middle of them, who can disabuse her of that happiness and hope. So, without further ado, with an of-the-moment title, The Industrial Strategy, What It Is, What It Isn't, and Lessons from History, can I introduce the newly minted Professor Davies. Thank you.
John, can I echo your welcome and thank you for the great partnership we're already starting to build between the business department and the Strand Group. As you say, I'm so excited about what the potential for the work we can do together, and Amelia is going to do amazing work, I know, for her PhD. The business department, and it's a pleasure to see a previous Secretary of State here in one of its previous guises, has got whilst its name may have changed, some of the roles may have changed over time, there's an incredible core that reaches back, not just through decades, but actually through centuries, right the way through the role of the Board of Trade, stretching all the way back into the 17th century. And I was really keen to bring out that institutional history, that sense of pride and purpose for this generation of civil servants who can build and know they're standing on the shoulders of predecessors who faced similar challenges. So Amelia, I'm super excited about the work you're doing, and I think you're going to provide some great insights. As you say, industrial strategy, John, very much of the moment. And what I thought I'd try and do tonight is use the opportunity to do that, to reflect back, because industrial strategy has many different connotations, many different definitions and meanings, but I wanted to bring it all the way back to what it is, crucially what it isn't, and actually learn some of those lessons from history about what's worked and what's not. And I think we know there's widespread recognition that the big challenge, the number one challenge facing the country, is economic growth. The Prime Minister said this is his most important mission of all the 5 missions. And I think we all know that growth has consistently underperformed since the great financial crisis. In the 20 years before the financial crisis, productivity grew at around 2% a year. In 20 years since, we've been lucky to reach 1%. And whilst this slowdown is true of all major Western economies, it's been particularly sharp here. Market dynamism, that reallocation of resources to the most productive sectors, the most productive firms, has fallen since 2008. But the biggest issue, the most defining challenge we face, is our historic low levels of investment. As John Van Reenen said, the UK productivity challenge can be summed up in 3 words: investment, investment, investment. We have systematically underinvested compared to our competitors. Our capital stock per worker is only half that in France. No wonder French productivity is higher, despite often more restrictive labour laws. This, for me, is a central challenge we need to face. The size, though, of the prize if we tackle this challenge is immense. This slightly slower growth every year doesn't bite immediately, but over time, that power of compounding really kicks in. If we'd maintained growth at pre-crisis rates, the economy would be about a third larger than it is today. As I say, imagine being 30% richer. Challenges like the climate transition, tackling poverty, strengthening our defence would feel far more tractable. Just to put it in a sense of scale in here, the economy would be around 800 billion a year larger. Tax revenues, about 250 billion pounds a year larger. You could effectively have the NHS for free. That's the size of the prize. That's what's been lost through the slowdown. And look, for me, this is personal. As you might be able to tell, I grew up in Liverpool in the 80s. And some of you may remember, not all of you, they were a pretty tough period. That was a pretty tough time. And I saw what happens when growth slows at first hand. I saw what happens when industries stop investing, when companies stop exporting, wages are flat, jobs are cut, families and communities suffer. Frankly, horizons narrow for their families. This isn't just numbers. This isn't just something you read about in the FT or The Economist. This is real life, real people, real opportunities. That's why economic policy, and particularly industrial strategy, is so important for us to get right. Now, I've worked in Whitehall for over 20 years. I've worked in economic policy in Downing Street, the Cabinet Office, in transport, and in the business department. I've worked for ministers for all political parties. I've been responsible for, I'd like to think, some successes, some failures. But the one thing I've taken through my time in the civil service is this appreciation of the role of history, and particularly what the Strand Group does. My first role was as an economist in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. We were just talking about the role of Jamie in that. I was working with Jeff Mulgan. What Jeff did was to build an incredible culture, one willing to go back to first principles, to ask why, rather than just accept something as it has always been done. But crucially for me, what he did is build a culture that valued the use of evidence, where teams were encouraged, and more to the point, expected to connect with the world-leading academics, learn from other countries, and connect with the past. I personally have been really influenced by the work of Neustadt and May, their book, Thinking in Time, which set out how careful analysis of history, individuals, and institutions can lead to better decision-making. And for me, it's this continuity of the civil service, this sense that someone has previously been grappling with the challenges that we're grappling with today is so important. The context may have changed, technology may have advanced, social norms could have shifted, but I always find by opening the files, it just gives you an insight into how people were looking at an issue, what played out as expected, what didn't, and crucially, it holds up a mirror to the way in which you're thinking about things and provides a new challenge to your implicit assumptions. As Permanent Secretary in the Department for Business and Trade, I'm responsible for developing the government's industrial strategy, working with Sam Lister, the new Director General for Industrial Policy. As I say, what I want to do tonight is set out what I have personally learned from industrial strategy and the history over time, and offer you some definitions, what's worked and what hasn't. First, let me touch on a bit of the history of industrial strategy, because even the phrase industrial strategy can be contentious and can elicit, I think it's fair to say, some strong opinions. And partly this is a reflection, I think, of its checkered history over the last 50 years. So where were we 50 years ago, back in 1974? The incoming Labour government, fresh from a surprise victory over Ted Heath, published a white paper, The Regeneration of British Industry. Just 15 pages long. I must admit, I wish modern white papers were similar brevity and clarity. It set out how far we'd been falling behind our competitors. It proposed a series of planning agreements with major manufacturing firms right the way across the economy. A new national enterprise board would take stakes in private sector companies with the aims of raising investment. However, in practice, it was consumed by the problems of British Leyland. And I think it was these repeated crises of the 1970s which fatally undermined the confidence in an activist industrial policy here, but also actually right the way across the West. The 1980s heralded a shift in focus away from industrial policy to one of competition and open markets. Industries were privatized and made to compete for customers and investment. Sweeping union reforms and wider deregulation aimed to increase productivity and growth, primarily through the power of market forces. And this focus on competition continued right the way through the new Labour administration. Gordon Brown summed it up by saying the best industrial policy for success in a global economy is to help markets work better. The 1998 Competitiveness White Paper, this time over 60 pages long, focused on the government's role in getting the foundations right. And if we remember back then, it was the height of the dot-com boom, so technology very much at centre stage. And the new Labour growth model was all framed around the 5 drivers of productivity: investment, enterprise, skills, competition, and science. Tellingly, sectoral policy merited only 3 paragraphs in passing. It was a shock of the financial crisis that really reopened the debate on industrial policy. Peter Mandelson's New Industry, New Jobs White Paper of 2009 heralded the shift to a new industrial activism. I think for the first time in over 20 years, it recognised the role that government had in shaping markets to build, and quote, a sustainable growth that addresses the social, economic and environmental challenges of the future. And it was this approach of active government support for the growth sectors that was continued by Vince Cable in the coalition government. The 2010s saw the creation of a range of institutional structures to support this new activism, many of which have endured to today. The Automotive Propulsion Centre, the Aerospace Technology Institute, supported the development and deployment of low-carbon technologies. The British Business Bank was set up to finance small business. A network of catapult centres was created to bridge the gap between universities and businesses in the technologies of the future. However, the contested nature of industrial strategy hadn't gone away, and that can be seen in the somewhat, what I would say is a stop-start nature of policy since 2015. The cable industrial strategy was stopped, and then a new approach was launched by Greg Clark in 2017. This strategy, this time at a whopping 254 pages, offered a comprehensive diagnosis of Britain's economic strengths and weaknesses. It was built around 3 pillars: strengthening the business environment, with focus on innovation, skills and competition policy; negotiating what was called sector deals with different parts of the economy; and a series, and this is the unusual bit, a series of grand challenges designed to bring together businesses, universities and public investment to tackle social problems. A change of Prime Minister and Chancellor in 2019 ultimately led to the formal closure of this policy. However, despite not having an overarching strategy, many of the individual elements and programmes and institutions were maintained. So, for example, the investment in battery technology through the Faraday Centre continued, and that ultimately helped land Tata's investment in the UK Gigafactory only last year. Andy Haldane, who chaired the Industrial Strategy Council, drew on a lot of the diagnosis and approach when developing his Levelling Up white paper. And so we've seen many attempts at industrial strategy with some common themes, and I'd argue some successful initiatives. However, too often these initiatives have been subscale and somewhat homeopathic. None have had the duration and durability needed to make a material difference. So looking out across the last 50 years, and then if we look out to the rest of the world, what can we draw out to define a modern industrial strategy? As with any definition, it's important to have sharp edges. We need to be clear about what it isn't as much as what it is. So let me suggest 5 characteristics. Firstly, it's about the shape and composition of the economy, not just another label for growth policy. Growth policy is about getting the foundations right. A competitive, dynamic market, high-quality infrastructure, an effective planning system, and a highly skilled workforce. This, in my mind, is what does the heavy lifting. The industrial strategy, though, is what the type of economy you want. Implicitly or explicitly, government policy helps shape the structure of the economy. So, for example, rules on work visas determine which sectors can bring in foreign workers into which type of jobs. Planning regulations determine what counts as a nationally significant infrastructure, as you've seen with the changes recently to the inclusion of data centres. Employment rights, again, recently with the Make Work Pay reforms, they will affect the quality of jobs, the inclusivity of growth, and crucially, the structure of the economy. So the question, and I think ultimately a political question, is how much to lean into this. One approach is to minimise the extent to which government decisions shape the economy. This would suggest a sector-neutral strategy, a sector-neutral planning regime, a visa system which only looks at income levels rather than identifying shortage skills, very much the approach we saw in the 80s, 90s and early noughties. In contrast, government set out an explicit vision for the economy, identifying the growth sectors and making conscious decisions how best to support them. This is very much the approach of the new Labour government, and as my Secretary of State, Jonathan Reynolds, has said, they will explicitly want to have an economy which is growing, but also one that is green, inclusive and secure. And for me, the challenge of the global context increases the need for governments to have this perspective, to have an explicit strategy. If you look at the four big mega trends, the 4Ds, if you like, of demographic transition, the need for decarbonisation, the opportunities of digitisation, and the need to strengthen our resilience and defence, makes it harder for governments to have a neutral view about the shape of the economy. We need to be explicit about what sovereign capability we need, what we're happy to source on global markets, and from whom. This is particularly important given, I think, a fifth potential D, the risk of deglobalization or globalization 2.0. Secondly, for me, it's about the whole of the economy and not just manufacturing. The phrase industrial strategy, which can be contentious, is also a bit of a misnomer. It can be seen just as focusing on manufacturing and trying solely to increase output, exports and jobs in that sector. And in fairness, some industrial strategies do that. The 74 industrial strategy was explicitly focused on 40 manufacturing sectors. One of the explicit goals of the Biden Inflation Reduction Act has been to increase the number of high-quality manufacturing jobs and increase production in the United States. But I would argue that this sole focus isn't appropriate in the UK context. You don't need me to say that we have deep strength in advanced manufacturing, especially engines, wings, and design. However, 80% of our economy has been service-based. Even in the early post-war period, manufacturing never exceeded 30% of total employment. And technology, when we're looking at trends over the next 10, 15 years, means that manufacturing will inevitably need fewer and fewer people for a given level of output. Now, we shouldn't underestimate the complementarities between sectors. Many of our service strengths are based on a robust and strong advanced manufacturing sector. For example, management consultants advise automotive companies. And actually also there's a lot of fuzzy definitions. Over half of Rolls-Royce's revenues are from services when they sell power by the hour rather than one-off sales of kit. And actually outsourcing has grown the service sector but is actually reliant on advanced manufacturing. But if government is to be serious about shaping the economy, it needs to look at more than just the 10% that's defined as manufacturing. Singapore, for example, in its Economy 2030 vision, has an ambition to grow the services sector and anchor Singapore as a leading, vibrant hub for businesses, lifestyle and tourism. Advanced manufacturing is important for the UK and will continue to be so. But as we identified in our recently published Green Paper, over half of the 8 growth sectors of the economy are going to be services, in creative, in digital, financial and professional. Third part of the definition is that it's about using a wide range of policy interventions, not just about subsidies. The discussion of industrial strategy typically focuses on the level of financial support being provided. One of the questions regularly raised is whether Britain has a balance sheet to support handouts on the scale of the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act in the US. For me, the easy answer is no, we don't. And nor does any country that doesn't have access to a global reserve currency. But I would also argue that even if we could afford that scale of intervention, that multi-hundred billions, if not trillions intervention, it would be a mistake to limit industrial policy just to the design and allocation of subsidies. And to be absolutely clear, in some sectors, for some companies, at a certain time, subsidies will be critical in securing investment. So, for example, the development of the next generation of aircraft engines will take decades and billions. And that's before any revenue comes on stream. Very few companies, even the largest, have the balance sheet to support that sort of investment on their own. But any financial support should be targeted, timely, and temporary. This includes the use of government guarantees and things like contracts for differences, which have made great impact in, for example, the energy sector. To use a football analogy, where we need to be is a much more forensic moneyball approach rather than splashing out on the big high-profile signings. And if we do look to some of the most successful industrial interventions, they have typically deployed a wide range of policy tools. In the UK, despite the historic professed skepticism at an institutional level within the Treasury, they have successfully run an implicit financial services industrial strategy for decades. When we're in the European Union, ministers would go to Brussels ready to promote or prevent regulations informed by the interests of our major banks. The Big Bang reforms of the 80s, support for Canary Wharf in the 90s, the Jubilee Line extension in the noughties, all were backed by the Treasury and helped create an environment where London could become a major global financial centre. And there are similar examples in other sectors. The requirement on the BBC to have a quarter of all programmes produced independently has helped catalyse the creative sector, as did the film tax credits introduced by the coalition government. In life sciences, I don't think we should underestimate the impact of the 100,000 Genome Project and how that's helped anchor the industry in the UK. And so for me, in this way, modern industrial strategy encompasses a wide range of interventions. It's regional economic policy. It's how mayors help shape and grow their local economy. It's about how a country's innovation policy works and how it uses missions, as championed by Mariana Mazzucato, to galvanise the public and private sectors to achieve social goals. Fourthly, industrial strategy is about how we compete and prosper in an open global economy. It's not about protectionism. Now, look, the history of industrial strategy is closely connected to the use of protective tariffs. In the United States, Alexander Hamilton, the first US Treasury Secretary, used tariffs as part of a wider strategy to strengthen the economy. Strangely, not included in the musical. However, as a recent study by the Peterson Institute shows, this strategy of industrialization through import substitution has at best a mixed track record. In the post-war period, it was championed in South America as a route to diversification away from dependence on commodity exports. However, the lack of competitive pressure, combined with rent-seeking, led to inefficient industries which struggle to innovate and grow. I think East Asia provides a much more interesting and contrasting approach. Their industrial policy was designed in the context of a rapidly globalizing economy. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan all grew through competitive export-focused sectors. In fact, it was the need to compete globally, that helped drive innovation and efficiency. Alongside targeted incentives, particularly around export promotion and trade finance, governments supported these industries to grow and flourish. And for me, this open, outward-facing approach also includes investment as well as trade. As I've set out, our challenge is how we increase business investment in the UK. And that's got to include foreign direct investment, which is responsible for about 20% of all investment in the country. And we know from our history that inward investment can have an outsized impact. It's not just about the direct jobs it creates, as important as those may be, but it also helps transform and modernize the sector and the local region in which the investment happens. You only need to look at the impact of Nissan's investment in Sunderland in the mid-80s. They, along with Toyota, helped to transform the UK auto industry. They created an extensive supply network and provided high-quality jobs across the Midlands and the North East. And this investment didn't happen by chance. It was targeted by my department with the active involvement of Margaret Thatcher at the time. I mean, ironically, at a point when industrial strategy was seen to be very much out of fashion. And this is really important in the UK context. We've got a long-standing culture as an outward-looking trading nation. Trade in the UK is 70% of our economy, compared to around a quarter in the US. In international surveys, we consistently have some of the highest levels of support for free trade. For example, a recent Pew survey, 50% said in the UK that growing trade and business ties were a very good thing. This was the highest of any developed country, 19 percentage points higher than in the United States, 18 percentage points higher than in France, 17 than in Germany. And unlike in many other countries, There's no big constituency for protectionism here. Fifthly and finally, industrial strategy needs to recognise the role and responsibilities of different levels of government. Too often, industrial strategy has been seen purely as a national strategy, something driven from the centre, and local government at best playing a reactive, responsive role. But this to me is to ignore the importance of local insight, local knowledge, and crucially, local ownership of any plan. Communities need to have a shared vision for how their areas will prosper and thrive over the coming years, where it has strengths, where it needs to improve, and local leaders are often better placed to bring together a package of policy interventions behind a long-term plan. And often they find it easier to provide the long-term consistency that investors need than some of the changes you see at the national level. You only need to look to the success of Greater Manchester through the leadership of the mayor and inspirational officials like Sir Howard Bernstein to show what's possible. Building a coalition for growth, making effective use of evidence and expertise, having an entrepreneurial approach to policy, and crucially, sticking the course over years and decades. The Greg Clark Industrial Policy of 2017 was the first one to really explicitly recognise the importance of local institutions, place, and the benefits of agglomeration. And in this way, it was much more in line with what happens in other countries. For example, the role of German Länder and the US states. And as Ed Balls showed in his recent Kennedy School paper on regional growth policy, whilst there may be a wide range of views about how to best design policy, the most appropriate policy architecture, but within the UK, there is now an emerging consensus around using the mayoral combined authorities as a core building block of this renewed local tier. So this is my definition of industrial strategy. Setting a direction for the whole economy, how it will compete, pay its way in an open, competitive global economy, how we'll use a full range of policy levers and all tiers of government to attract investment. Crucially, it needs to align work across three dimensions: the national strategy, the national business environment, sectoral strategies, and bottom-up plans for local areas. But I think we all need to be clear, and we need to recognise, based on this history, that industrial strategy isn't easy to get right. Danny Roderick identifies two challenges any industrial strategy needs to overcome: information and capture. How can governments have the information needed to correctly design the interventions? And how can government prevent lobbying for private rather than public benefit? The risk is government isn't able to say no. And rather than picking winners, to use that phrase, it's somewhat saddled with subsidising losers. In my view, the failures of the 1970s led to an overcorrection. I think whilst these challenges are real, they shouldn't be a counsel of despair. Government policy will inevitably shape the structure of the economy. So the question for me is not whether to have an industrial policy, but it's how to use those lessons from history to best design and execute that strategy. I've drawn some lessons from the UK and around the world. My first one: you can't escape history. Not a difficult message for a bunch of historians. When you look at the most successful examples of industrial policy in advanced economies, what they do well is build off deep comparative advantages. You look to post-war Germany. They focus on building a balanced manufacturing sector based on exports. It emphasized the Mittelstand, invested in technical education and work skills. Regional banks, along with the KfW, provided the patient capital. Businesses and unions collaborated to combine innovation and productivity with higher wages. All of this drew on its deep-rooted tradition of engineering and craftsmanship. The apprenticeship system built off the old guild system. Germany has historically had strong regions with deeply embedded production clusters: automotive in Bavaria, steel in the Ruhr Valley. An industrial strategy in the UK needs to work with the grain of our existing institutions and industrial structure. It needs to recognise that a 2.7 trillion economy with a 5 trillion capital stock can't be designed afresh. A blank sheet of paper approach is doomed to failure. The foundation of any strategy needs to start from a clear-eyed assessment of our relative strengths as a country. What makes us distinctive? At our recent investment summit at the Guildhall, a number of consistent themes came out from my discussions with investors. expertise in content and creativity across a diverse range of sectors, manufacturing and advertising, video games and AI, education and culture. A global outlook with extensive historic, yes, complex links across the world, and a long history of financial and professional services dating all the way back to the 17th century coffee houses and the Glorious Revolution. Secondly, metrics matter. One way to tackle the risk of lobbying, of capture, of supporting losers is to be clear about what counts for success. A risk with industrial strategies have too many diffuse and ill-defined goals. Instead, you need to set sharply defined metrics to test what's working and what's not. And crucially, these metrics need to be set at the right level. Whilst the ultimate goal is always going to be growth, productivity, higher living standards, it's hard to sometimes connect them with individual interventions. As Giles Wilkes set out in a recent review of industrial strategy, these variables adjust slowly and are influenced by a wide range of factors outside the scope of the formal industrial policy. So instead, you need to have a set of more proximate metrics. For example, business investment, skills, R&D, exports, job creation in the specific growth sectors. For me, one test of success will be the number of $100 billion companies that we have based in the UK. But metrics only matter if you're willing to learn and adapt. You need to be ready to stop interventions that aren't working and double down on those that are. You need to give interventions enough time to mature, but at the same time watch for the sunk cost fallacy that can result in good money being thrown after bad. The National Enterprise Board of the late 70s spent too much time, too much energy, and too much money keeping failing companies on life support rather than fostering those industries of the future. In my experience and looking at the history, the best interventions recognize that uncertainty up front. They design in opportunities to change and stop based on experience. The 2017 Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, developed by John Kingman, Mark Woolport, and Patrick Vallance, was very effective in this regard. It had a series of societal-based challenge funds around clean growth, an aging society, future mobility, and AI, just showing it's not just a modern fad, but actually goes all the way back to 2017, with flexible stage gate funding, which gave ministers and politicians the ability and space to be able to move funding to areas which were working. Thirdly, we need to build in competition to the policy. It's really easy in designing an industrial policy to be influenced by a particularly compelling sales pitch from business. Often I hear, if only the government would invest, if only the government would change a regulation, approve a planning decision, then investment, export, and jobs will follow. And even if that pitch is right, even if that support would be truly additional, you always need to test whether it's the best thing you could be doing. Money and attention are in short supply in government. You need to be very conscious of the opportunity costs of any intervention. Supporting this company, this sector, always means you're not supporting someone else. And Greg Clark, when he was business secretary, I always love your quote, Greg, on this. He said the test of a good strategy is that it involves choices. And the question is how those choices are made. You need to be sure that you're not just dealing with companies that make it in through the front door, the companies that know how to get into Downing Street or the business department or the Treasury. It means actively reaching out to the new entrants, the challengers. The strategy needs to foster entrepreneurialism and market dynamism, which frankly has been declining in all Western economies bar the US since the financial crisis. Now, sometimes it'll be more appropriate to do a direct negotiation, particularly when a multinational is choosing where to locate a new production facility or a new research centre. But in my mind, the default should be an open competitive process, which means a focus on sectors rather than individual companies. This is the best way to identify opportunities and ensure value for money. A great example of this is the open calls used by ARIA, the new Advanced Research and Innovation Agency. Fourthly, what do we need to do? We need to stick at it. Consistency matters. When companies make investment decisions, they're making them with a multi-year perspective. It's not about whether the policy environment is right now. It's about whether over the next 5, 10, 20 years, this is going to be a good place for them to do business. They want to understand how they fit into the economic and industrial strategy of the country. And this is why, in my mind, the stop-start, the contested nature of industrial strategy has been so deleterious and so undermined business investment. Diane Coyle has identified the lack of the consistency as a central failing of industrial policy in the UK. Companies need to know that a priority this year will continue to be a priority next. When you look at the most successful industrial strategies, and I would call out Singapore, post-war Germany, South Korea, they have a consistent, coherent proposition about how and where the country will compete and prosper. Now, policy needs to reflect different political priorities over the electoral cycle. But in my mind, these changes need to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary if industrial policies have an impact. And if you look to the UK, beneath an often chopping and changing stop-start nature of industrial policy, you can see the successes of sectors like life science and renewables, and that shows what's possible with a sustained, consistent set of policy interventions. This can be buttressed by strong institutions. The Office of Budget Responsibility and the Climate Change Committee have helped improve the quality of fiscal and energy policy over the last 2 decades. In Australia, the Productivity Commission provides independent advice, guidance, and challenge on the performance of the economy. The new Industrial Strategy Council, which will be chaired by Claire Barclay, aims to tackle this long-standing weakness in the UK and will be put on a statutory footing. We also, though, need to strengthen the capability and capacity at local levels through local institutions, in particularly the mayoral combined authorities, which have the potential to provide long-term consistency of approach. And then fifthly, my lesson from history would be the importance of partnership with business. One of the most important points to remember when designing industrial policy is that ultimately this is about businesses and whether they will invest. Now, following the budget, there's been a lot of focus on public sector investment and the increases the Chancellor has made. But business investment is over 3 times the size of public sector investment. And it's business investment that will ultimately drive productivity, wages, and growth. Now, technical policy design, for example, full expensing, is obviously crucially important. But business investment decisions are also a question of behaviour change. It's about encouraging a chief executive to commit capital, to take a risk. And so for me, in part, this is about social psychology. What industrial strategy needs to do is create a sense of excitement, to make people look at a country in a different way. Frankly, to ignite the animal spirits of investors. Choose France was successful because it offered a compelling vision, built a sense of momentum. They used the investment summits to focus energy and encourage businesses to look at France in a new light. This is why, for me, the sector councils can be so important. If, a big if they're designed properly, with a clear purpose, strong leadership, they're a way for businesses and government to come together, to overcome some of the information asymmetries Roderick has talked about, and to create a shared strategy for the industry. An exemplar of this is the Life Sciences Council under the leadership of Sir John Bell. It brings together the leading chief executives, ministers from the health and the business departments, and officials to agree joint commitments to grow the industry. And it's this collaborative, joint approach that helps overcome the information challenge and crucially ensures buy-in and commitment from all sides. But look, there is a tension here. Collaboration, if not structured properly, can slide into lobbying. The business voice does always need to be challenged. You've got to engage, as I've said, with new entrants as well as the incumbents. But there's a mirror risk of being too cynical, of holding businesses at arm's length, and as a result, not understanding what will really take to shift sentiment and to shift those investment decisions. And ultimately, this rests on having a high-quality capability and expertise within the civil service teams. So these are my 5 lessons. You can't escape your history. Metrics matter. Build in competition. Stick at it. And remember, ultimately, it's a partnership with business. And some final reflections. Despite the contested nature of industrial policy, The real question for me is not whether, but how the policy should be designed and delivered. Different governments will rightly make political decisions about how much to lean into shaping the economy, where on the spectrum they want to position themselves. But all modern governments will have a profound influence on the structure of the economy, implicitly or explicitly. Getting industrial strategy right involves complex policy institution design. It needs rigorous use of evidence and evaluation. It needs this complex balance of consistency of approach, but a flexibility to adapt and learn. Strong institutions can help governments achieve the right balance. But in my experience, the most important factor is this strong partnership approach between businesses, unions, local leaders, universities, and government. Because only through this collaboration, through this challenge, you can create this sense of shared goal, the sense of excitement, the sense of shared endeavour needed to unlock investment, and ultimately drive the growth, productivity, and higher living standards that we all know the country needs. So will it be different this time? We've been here before. I've been here before. The global context, though, for me, of the demographic shift, decarbonisation challenge, opportunities of digitisation, needs of defence, question, deglobalisation, means that the government has to make explicit choices about the shape of the economy it wants, what sovereign capability it needs, what it's happy to buy and from whom. Businesses, when I talk to them, recognise this and wants the government to have a vision for how it will compete over the next decade. And this means that for the first time in my experience, there's an alignment across government, particularly across the Treasury, Business Department and Downing Street, that we need an explicit strategy. Nothing is certain, but for me the stars are aligned in a way I haven't seen in my 20 years in Whitehall. We have a really great opportunity to mobilise investment at the scale needed to shift productivity, create high-quality jobs, and deliver the growth we need. Thank you very much.
Well, that was quite packed, which hopefully means that there's plenty of scope for questions. We've got plenty of time. Who's first? Can I have name and affiliation, please? Who's first? Yes. Yeah.
My name's Peter. I'm a recent graduate of King's College, and I think for me maybe potentially simple, but also maybe not so simple question. How do you think government can tackle the problem of short-termism? Ultimately, people want quick results when it comes to elections to get re-elected.
How can government solve short-termism? And we do have some mics coming around for secondary questions, please.
Great question. I'm very tempted to bring Greg in at this point, who's been at the sharp end of this one. But look, more seriously, you're totally right. There's always going to be this push me. There's always going to be that push me pull you because, from a personal basis, we know the scale of the challenge we're facing as a country, and the idea of saying, "Oh, just wait another 5 years and it'll all be great," is a hard sell. I'd say I've spent time in business, and when I worked in AIA, you felt exactly the same pressures there. So, this is not just a business, it's not just a government challenge, it's also a business challenge. They have the pressure of the quarterly results, the investor calls, but also playing for the long term. And for me, I think what you've got to try and pull off is this sense of having a clear North Star, a clear sense of long-term direction, a clear sense of what the core of your strategy is. And by that I don't mean the strategy as in a 500-page document, but the core essence of how you're going to compete as a country or as a company. And then make sure that you can have proof points along the way. I think the one thing we got right in 2017 would be we developed the strategy, but we didn't do it all in sequence. We did a lot of things in parallel. So we took time to do the green paper, the white paper, to build the consensus, to build a shared sense of endeavour. But we didn't say, and you've got to wait for implementation for years. At the same time, we were investing in the Faraday Battery Centre. We were showing what was possible and, frankly, having exemplars and proof points about what a successful strategy should be. So my answer really is you've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You've got to basically be able to do both. The crucial thing is what you're doing in the short term should be building you towards the long-term goal you're setting.
Who's next? Yes, please.
Thank you. That was terrific. Thank you. I'm Laura Spence. I'm Professor of Business Ethics and Sustainability at King's Business School. Really interesting, your sort of five points to think about future industrial strategies. You threw in the comment about the Labour government and seeking industrial and growth and all the rest of it, marvellous, and also inclusion and decarbonisation. Given that previous industrial strategies have not covered themselves with glory in achieving inclusion and decarbonisation, what lessons can we learn from the way things have gone in the past to make that change now with a new industrial strategy?
Great question. I think often previous industrial strategies haven't been so explicit about some of these the wider social goals as well as the economic goals. And I think, we all have our views about some of the tumultuous politics over the last 15, 20 years, but I think part of it for me is a reflection that not all parts of the country have felt included in growth. Even when we've had relatively high levels of economic growth, there's still been large numbers of communities, large numbers of families who felt disconnected. I think the famous quote from the Brexit referendum was, "That's your GDP, not mine." And so to have a sustained basis for your comparative advantage, to have a sustained basis for which companies and businesses can invest against, you need to also maintain that social support for your economic policy, which is why, yes, I'm sure at times there can be a tension between, say, inclusion policies and economic growth, but over any meaningful medium or long-term strategy, you've got to be able to do both and on this.
Thank you. Run the centre here, please.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. My name's Tim Lancaster. This may sound a bit implausible, but I was part of the 1975 industrial strategy. I was the grade 5 in the Treasury responsible for industrial strategy. You've told us what the failures were. The failure in the 1970s was tripartism. We had 40 sector working parties. They were talking shops. Yeah. Very little came out of them. We were very democratic. We talked and we talked and we talked and we analysed, but nothing very much happened. 2 planning agreements were signed, I think, one with Chrysler and one with another company, and they didn't really achieve much. As you said, the macroeconomic position made strategy very difficult, but I think it was poorly designed. I'd like to make 3 points. First of all, you didn't mention macroeconomics. Critical to get the macro right. I think it's no coincidence that the best period in the last 50 years for productivity increase was the best period for macro, which was 1992 to 2008. I'm not going to comment on the recent budget. That could go down many tracks. But I would say that I think the period 2010 to 2016 was seriously damaged by an excessive deflation. So we achieved 1.5% GDP growth per year. We could have had it faster, and there was no reason why we couldn't have a more expansionary economic policy. George Osborne was absolutely obsessed with debt levels. The analysis in America that said if you went above 90% debt of GDP, you're in trouble. That was wrong. So you've got to get the macroeconomics right. Very difficult for your department because you're not party to the budget. But that was a problem back in the 70s too. Secondly, you mentioned technology and innovation, but glancingly. I used to believe that investment was everything. In recent years, I've been reading Edmund Phelps, more recently Daniel Susskind. Innovation is about half of what contributes to economic growth. You've got to have investment, but you've got to have innovation. And innovation, a lot of it comes from smaller operations. And I think there has to be a climate that supports entrepreneurship. I mean, when I was growing up, nobody started businesses. Very few people started businesses. We all went into ICI but you know, I think the greatest thing that Thatcher did for the economy was provide, and I was her private secretary in '81. She went to one NEDI meeting, came back and said, never again. I think innovation and the climate for innovation and how you provide that climate. And I think we've heard nothing really from the new government about this. I think it's incredibly important, very difficult. I don't quite know how you do it, but Susskind and Phelps and others analyze this, and I think they do it very deeply. The third point is expertise. You mentioned this. There has to be very strong expertise in analyzing and identifying what to support and what not to support. You mentioned client capture. We were captured by the clients in the 70s. You're onto that. But I think the analysis is so important. Identifying sectors where productivity increases can be fast. And I worry that in recent years, the expertise in Whitehall has not been as strong as it could have been. There's been too much subcontracting out of expertise. I think there has to be very strong expertise within government. I mean, HS2, to my mind, is a complete disaster, partly because the analysis was so poor, and it was contracted out to the company that was mandated to undertake the project. HS2 Limited produced most of the analyses that allegedly supported this 100 billion white elephant. I'm an economist by background, and I think getting that analysis, strong analysis, and making sure that ministers really focus on the results. I mean, Michael Gove has his qualities, but when he said a few years ago there was too much expertise, he didn't believe in expertise. It was ridiculous. The civil service can provide this, and don't contract too much of it out. If you do contract it out, you've got to have very good customer, what's the word? You have to be able to understand and criticize. Sorry, I've said far too much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but it was all interesting, so Tim, please.
Well, God, there's a lot. I think you should be here and I should be there, to be honest. There's a lot to learn. And I enjoyed reading the 74 and 75 white papers over summer. I thought, seriously, model of clarity. You're totally right. There's a lot of ills in a nation, and you've got to get the macro environment. The macro environment is absolutely critical. There's a lot of, as a necessary condition. On tech and innovation, entrepreneurship, this is the point I was trying to touch on the collapse, and it's a collapse in the level of market dynamism. I think this is not just in the UK; it's across. The recent IMF paper from I think April this year, it's striking the fall in levels of market dynamism, and no one quite knows what's going on there, except for in the US. Maybe that's something about the scale of the economy we don't know. On your specific question on expertise, one thing we've done in the business department is make sure we've got more people who have worked in business. Not saying that private good, public bad, but it's important to understand what the world looks like from both sides. I personally spent over a decade in the private sector. In each of the sector teams that you'll remember, we've brought in either people who've worked in those sectors or analysts from banks and funds to make sure that we can go toe-to-toe with companies when we're negotiating interventions. Because you're right. I would say the companies are always going to be highly incentivized to be able to out-negotiate us. So we've got to make sure we have the professionalism and the expertise on our side as well.
Thank you. I think there was a question here. Yeah.
Thanks. It's Anna Taylor from Public First. I just wanted to ask a little bit about how the delivery of an industrial strategy would interact with the fact that there's increasing devolution in England. And of course, we have Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, where a lot of the tools to make it happen on a regional level, skills, 16 to 18 education, kind of managing the relationships with prospective investors, would happen potentially with very new mayoral teams or combined authorities with new powers. And so if we do want to see results, like the gentleman said, in the next 10 years, we can't have delay. How do you see that relationship managing, and what would central government do to help build out that capacity?
Yeah. This is frankly where it gets tricky. And frankly, sometimes I think sometimes industrial policy can be messy because there are, it will depend on the capability and capacity in different institutions. For me, it's got to work across three dimensions. There's something about the national business environment, your national competition policy, your trade policy, the broad macro environment we were just talking about. It'll then have a series of sector strategies, which we need to bring together, and then also a set of bottom-up plans coming from local areas. And how you bring together those three dimensions is incredibly hard, because you want to make sure they're aligned, but you don't want to make it so complex that any one person feels they can't do anything without wading through treacle. And so sometimes actually it may be a bit messy and there might be some rough edges. And I think what's going to be really important at the local level is to, frankly, go with where the energy and capability is. And so it won't always be everyone moving in lockstep. I think you've seen that over the last 10 years. Look what, Manchester has leapt ahead based on the capability. They've got their desire to see change and drive it themselves. And we should learn and not think it's all about a plan designed centrally, imposed on local government, for example, but we should be allowing that sort of essentially competition of institutional structures and different ideas. Where I think central government can play a role is in two ways. One is just how we approach it, and there's always that risk of having the very tidy mind, the sort of blank sheet of paper approach, and trying to map it all out from the centre, and imposing a tidiness which doesn't recognise the reality of life on the ground. The second thing I think we can do, though, because you're right to say that some mayoral authorities have got different histories or different levels of maturity. I would like to base more of my teams in those mayoral authorities on the, being a pull rather than a push from me. So in other words, being pulled in by the mayors and having people. Already, I've got people from the Office for Investment, our expert body to bring in inward investment, based in mayoral authorities. I'd like to build out that approach and think about how we can help them essentially catalyse and accelerate the development of local capability.
Lovely. Got a question here, please.
James Johns, I'm a visiting fellow at the... Thank you. Hi, I'm James Johns. I'm a visiting fellow at the Strand Group, and my day job is as Head of Government Affairs for a tech company. What's wrong with lobbying?
Nothing's wrong with lobbying, providing there's some decent capture. You've got to watch for the capture, you've got to watch, therefore you've got to have the challenge. So this is all about trying to get balance right. And you can see sometimes Whitehall swings from one extreme to another. They're either, we've got to listen to business and just do what business says, or we risk going, can't talk to business, they're just it's private interest. And so you've got to engage, but engage intelligently, back to the gentleman's comments, with expertise, and an understanding of what your incentives might be compared to what our incentives and where the Venn diagrams overlap.
Thank you. I've got two questions at the back. In the corner first, please. That's it.
Thank you. Chris Dobson from EY. Gareth, that's a cracking talk. Thank you very much. My question is, you talked about the need for consistency over time and to avoid sort of chop and change over political cycles, which I absolutely agree with, but it's quite a hard thing to do in practice. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you're going about that, please.
It is hard to do. And you don't want, and again, there's a risk, Chris, to sort of suggest that the technocrats take over and there's no role for politics. And I think there's an absolute crucial role for politics in industrial strategy. Because ultimately, to your point, this is about the nature of the type of economy you want. And quite rightly, different political parties will have different views on that. But there's a risk we focus only on what differs rather than where the overlaps might be and where the commonalities might be. And so let's look to what's worked rather than what hasn't. I think energy policy is a great example of how consistency can really work through. The role of market design, use of contracts for differences, has had an incredible impact in terms of, say, offshore wind. The composition now of our energy production mix is completely different to where we thought it might be 10, 15 years ago. And so it's trying to work out the ways in which you can start to build consensus around particular areas. And look, we both worked on policy back a long time ago now, isn't it? Almost over 20 years? On pensions policy. And there's ways in which you can appropriately build consensus, which creates a space for politics. So, for example, in pensions policies, the level of compulsory contributions, the exact point at which the state pension age kicks in, but create an architecture and an infrastructure that coheres over time.
No?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, my name's Stephen Bediako. I'm an entrepreneur, grew up and based in the UK, but I've been in the US for the last 7 years, in California for the last 5, in New York for the last 2. A couple kind of observations, questions. One, how much is this about confidence? And confidence, you know, running through the UK psyche? Just interested in your reflections on that. And then 2, have you looked at California as a place, right? Germany, Singapore, great examples. But for my time in California, I saw a lot of parallels with your point about building on the fabric of your place. You know, Manhattan Project is really the precursor to the technology industry we see eating our world today. And I guess from that perspective, they are winners, right? They are winning, they have won, and just wondering, how much are you looking at that place for the way California has emerged as, you know, one of the biggest economies in the world?
Yeah, no, really good point. Funny, an early draft of the lecture did include something on California, but I felt it was such a well-trodden ground, and everyone, you know, there's a period in government policy where everyone wanted a silicon, this, that, and the other. I think lots of countries around the world always sort of try and think how we could have a Silicon Valley. And it's hard to find what that essence is. Maybe there's something about the nature of, the scale of the US economy is very different, and frankly, the returns to scale have been very large over the last 15 years. But you're right, I mean, they have won on tech, and I think there's a lot we should be looking to there, particularly around not just how you can start up a business. I'd be interested in your perspective on this, because I think actually the UK's got a lot better on startup. It's probably gone from 2 out of 10 to about 8 out of 10 now. But we've never tackled the next bit, the scale-up challenge. And we're stuck at that point. And frankly, a lot of great businesses get snaffled up, they get bought. I'm not sure we're actually clear whether that's a good or a bad thing. For the individuals, it's probably a great thing. But for a country, is that a good or a bad thing? Sometimes, you know, if they're based here, like Google DeepMind is a great example of actually where that's worked well, but others maybe less so. But your broader point on confidence, I totally agree. Because industrial strategy, by the nature of it, sounds incredibly technocratic. And again, you do need to have that proper, detailed, expert, analytical work. But there's a vibe thing going on here as well. Because ultimately, again, I don't need to tell you this, to start up a business, to make an investment, it's about taking a punt. You can do as much analysis as you like, you can have your business plans, but ultimately, you're taking a punt on that market, on that country. And you've got to create a level of excitement. And I think at its best, the best industrial strategies do create that level of excitement, that sense of confidence, the sense the country is going somewhere. And as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, I want to be part of it. And I think that's a trick we've got to pull off.
Okay, down the front here.
Dominic Ray, I'm another one from the Big Four here. So I'm actually going to pose this question from the other side of it, which, as I remember my strategy professor used to always say, strategy means choices. But that means that they're always the ones that don't get chosen. And I guess, you know, and talking about all these points about how you stay the course, how you keep it, you know, through the political chopping and changing, I think a lot of it can come down to that the ones that don't get chosen feel left out and then start wanting a piece of the action. So how do you address that so that you're not just sort of, you know, and at the extreme, you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul, you know, it's sort of like you don't want to be bleeding the cash cow in order to in order to take your bets, you know, because you still need to be having those parts of the business of the economy that maybe you're not investing in, but you still need them to keep going, and that, you know, you can't just let them fall by the wayside.
100%. And you're right, any good strategy worth its name involves a choice. But at the same time, recognizing that we don't have all the information in government, and frankly, no one does, because the economy, you know, the economy is growing in unpredictable ways. You know, the explosion on LLMs, for example, is a great example of that over the last few years. You've always got to be open to a new proposition and new. So you've got to be open and recognize this is always going to evolve as a strategy. But I think there is something about saying this is an explicit view about where the country is going and where we really can compete. So what we have done in this industrial strategy is be really clear. We've identified growth sectors, and the work that Sam and his team has done is to use, I think, excellent analysis to say these sectors, 30% of the economy, so that's a choice, but they have been chosen on the basis that they represent 60% of productivity growth over the last decade, and an assessment of export markets and growth in jobs and productivity. So there's some choices there. But you've got to be able to align the politics as well to these choices. Again, it's not just a technocratic process. So I think you get the longevity then by showing success, and you've got to build off that success, and then ultimately you can align the politics as well as the actual policy choices. But it is hard. But you should never have your door closed. And I've always said to businesses I see, yes, we've identified the 8 sectors, and we'll be more granular about the subsectors. But there are foundation industries that we'll need to work with, and if there's great new emerging opportunities for the UK, we're never going to say, well, hang on, our analysis in 2024 said no. You've always got to be open to that.
Thanks very much, Gareth. My name's Tom Cliff. I'm a civil servant in your department, and I work for your chief scientist. I'm also very kindly being funded to do the MA course, so thank you very much.
You can ask a nice question now.
Do you know what? I don't want to hear a question. Just move on now. He's done his job.
I wondered if you could touch a bit more on the technocratic side, because you touched on the political. How do we make sure that bureaucracy doesn't get in the way? And particularly, how do we present a clear sort of door to business? Because we've got a number of departments, obviously, with economic policy interests. Particularly with the Treasury, we talked about perhaps the tensions there, with the Treasury being perhaps more short-termism, and there's been, I think, a number of examples in history where the sort of variant of DBT, whether that's DIT or Bayes, has perhaps set the industrial strategy agenda and then has not necessarily had all of the levers to carry that out. Obviously, the budget's the main one, but there are others. Yeah. So I just wonder if you could reflect on that for me.
Yeah, no, look, great question. And I think an industrial strategy fails if it's just seen as the business department strategy. If this is just the DBT industrial strategy, we'll have completely failed. Any industrial strategy needs to be a whole of government approach, because levers or policy interventions that affect business are right the way across. I've struggled to think of any department that really doesn't have a role on economic growth now. DEFRA, environmental regulation, plays out crucially in terms of what's going on in retail industries, plastics recycling and the like. DCMS back probably 20 years ago, was that the period of the Department for Fun? I think it probably was. Maybe.
Arts and darts, wasn't it?
Yeah. Creative is one of our most important sectors. It's our real sense of comparative advantage. There's very, education, obviously absolutely critical, quality of skills is going to be absolutely critical to our industrial policy. So I struggle to think of a department that shouldn't be involved in it. So I think our role is to be the convener, to bring them together and to create that cross-government strategy, to be the voice of business. I always say, what's different about the Department for Business, given businesses will be talking right the way across Whitehall, including into the Treasury, into Downing Street, is we're the one department that covers all businesses in all sectors across the UK, because we've got people based right the way across the UK, as I mentioned, including the devolved nations. We've also got people based right the way across the world. We're based in 110 countries around the world. So it's that business perspective, understanding what businesses are asking for, the right level of challenge on the lobbying point, but making sure that we understand businesses, that's our USP, and then bringing that together into a single combined strategy. Where we get it wrong in Whitehall, and one of my frustrations, is that sense of siloism. So you can see, if you're, Airbus, so it's front of mind because I'm speaking to them at the moment, they come to us to speak about industrial policy and trade policy. They might speak to the science department about collaborations with universities. They then need to speak to the MOD about defence contracts, education, on apprenticeships. It's all a bit, we make people navigate their way around. Any large organisation is complex. I'm sure universities are quite complex to navigate in their own way. I'm sure King's is all totally clear all the time. Certainly when I've worked in the private sector, amazingly silos do emerge. We should be doing more to hide the wiring. I think a great success has been the Office for Life Sciences, because what that's done is essentially said, let's have a team that's facing out to the industry, out to business, and then we all connect the dots. We should have more of those offices. I'd love to have an office for creative, an office for professional services, an office for advanced manufacturing, an office for financial services, which helps connect the dots across Whitehall. I think there's a bit of our architecture we could get right as a result of this industrial strategy that would help. It's never going to solve it, but help make it easier.
Very interesting. Sorry, but a last question right here, please.
Thank you. My name's Greg Clark. I've been introduced from the stage, but not with my current affiliation. I'm now at the University of Warwick, helping promote innovation there, and I can confirm that universities are very complex places as well. It's terrific, a fantastic talk, and it's very encouraging that the approach that you and Sam and the Secretary of State are taking the time to learn from what worked and what didn't work in developing the strategy for the future. And for those students here at King's and the Strand Group, it's great that they're going to have the opportunity to work with you and listen to you in your tenure as visiting professor. My question is, looking back to when we developed the industrial strategy in 2017, we tried to think about the industries in which we had, as you put it in your lecture, a comparative advantage, and to, as it were, sort of double down on that. Since then, with COVID and various events around it and after it, there's been more of a focus on the security of supply chains, and in particular, things that we took for granted that we could reliably import and therefore specialize in areas of comparative advantage. It turned out that we couldn't reliably. So to what extent is that going to be, does it need to be reflected in the approach that you're thinking about?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, 2017 is not that long ago, but it's incredible what's happened in between. I think some of the COVID experience, some of the geopolitical tensions as well has changed the context in which we're operating in. I mean, the goals for the industrial strategy below the overall of the fastest growth in the G7, living standards, is around the sense of, yes, green, inclusive, but also secure growth, and that sense of how can we get the right level of resilience for supply chains. I think one of the things we learned, not just actually through COVID, but when we worked on some of the Brexit analysis, the complexities of supply chains, how parts, for example, in JLR move across borders multiple times. I think it's fair to say surprised the companies as much as it did the government. So that sense of resilience is important and will be embedded as part of the strategy. I think it's critical, though, that resilience of supply chains doesn't necessarily just mean you've got to make it all in this country. There's different ways in which you can achieve resilience. Sometimes it's about domestic production, quite rightly. I talked about steel, and I think that will be an important example of some parts of the steel production process, some of the subsectors within steel. You'd always want to have a sovereign capability. But other times it'll be about ensuring that you're just not over-reliant on any one country, one factory for production. Sometimes our resilience can best come from making sure that imports are coming from 2, 3, 4 countries or multiple competitors. So that's where the integration of our trade strategy into the industrial strategy is going to be absolutely vital. Thanks.
Look at that, 1945, bang on time. You're good. Well, I thought that was magnificent. Lots to chew on, and a story of the moment, but one that's going to run and run, of course, right? Will you join me in thanking for a fabulous inaugural lecture, Professor Gareth Davies?
Thank you.